Hey everybody, I'm Rosalyn and Andrew, and welcome to Season 4 of Refocus. Each episode, I'm joined by incredible guests from all areas of the music industry for real and informative conversations with a focus on folk. Hello and welcome to Refocus. Our guest today is Andrew Cash. Andrew Cash is the president and CEO of the Canadian Independent Music Association, also known as CIMA, the voice of Canada's independent music sector. As a member of Parliament from 2011 to 2015, Cash championed the music sector while raising awareness of the realities of making a living in Canada as arts and culture workers. He continued this mission post-Parliament, co-founding the nonprofit Urban Worker Project. As a singer-songwriter, producer, and performer, Cash spent 25 years touring and recording, first in the post-punk band L'Étranger, followed by a successful solo career, as well as several collaborations, including the Cash Brothers with Peter Cash, Skydiggers, and Jason Collett. He has created soundtrack music for television, including a series composer for Dragon's Den. Cash has released over a dozen records, and his contributions as an artist have earned him a Juno Award and 3 SOCAN Awards. Welcome, Andrew. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
I'm so glad to get to have a chance to chat with you. There's a lot going on in the world of CIMA at the moment. But first of all, I wanted to wish you and the company a happy birthday. You've got a big birthday coming up, huh?
Right. 2025, we turned 50.
50 years. Congratulations. And I'm wondering if we can start off by explaining a bit about CIMA and what you've been doing over the last 50 years for anybody who might not be familiar with the organization.
I'm just over 3 years in this position. But CIMA was initially formed by a handful of Canadian-owned record labels and Canadian producers in the 70s at a point where the Canadian music sector was virtually dominated by the US industry. And there was a movement, a cultural movement that also kind of filtered its way up to the political policymakers as well, to start to build instruments and regulations that would help foster a Canadian music industry. Now, that didn't happen really by accident. It happened in many ways because of the advocacy work of this group that banded together to form CIMA 50 years ago, which at that time was called CIRPA, the Canadian Independent Record Producers Association. And the nucleus of that team, of those founders, really made a huge impact, a positive impact on the Canadian music industry that all of us really are reaping the benefits of today. CIMA has been a strong advocate, both on the policy level. It was on the ground floor of creating Factor. Radio Star Maker, which is now called Canadian Star Maker Fund, has been instrumental in bolstering and strengthening Canadian content regulations on radio, and various ways in which copyright law has helped strengthen the Canadian music industry too. So on a policy level, it is a really key voice for the Canadian-owned music sector. And I want to stress Canadian-owned because there's really 2 music industries in Canada. They exist in connection to each other, but they are very different. And the one that CIMA represents are Canadian-owned companies that are trying to develop Canadian businesses in music that are successful and can promote and develop and support excellent Canadian artists in every genre to find audiences both in Canada and on the world stage. That's essentially what CIMA does.
And this is in contrast to when we're talking about major labels, we're talking about multinational corporations that are not owned outright by Canadian companies.
Right. So, the other music industry is represented by foreign-owned multinationals who do business in Canada. And their raison d'etre is to sell global stars to the Canadian market. That is why they are here. That is not why Canadians who work for these companies are working for them. And, we need to be clear on that. Everybody loves Canadian music. Everyone wants to see the Canadian music industry thrive. When we're talking about the business of music, there are 2 businesses. One is developing Canadian artists for Canadian audiences and try to build those audiences globally to bring money back home. The multinationals sell artists in Canada to take money out. And they invest in Canada too, and I want to make that clear, and have had incredible success with incredible Canadian artists. That is not to diminish any of that at all, but we just need to be clear that there are two different things, like there's two different jobs going on here, and the realities of them are different. And the Canadian music sector is fighting on a very unbalanced playing field, and CIMA strives to help balance that a bit more through some of these regulatory means like Factor, Music Action, Star Maker, other regulatory measures that we're now seeing as a result of Bill C-11 and the broadcast reforms.
Yeah, I was going to wait till we warmed up a bit to bring in Bill C-11, but this seems like a good time. CIMA's been such a strong advocate for the Canadian independent music sector. And whenever there are these policy reforms, CIMA's always at the very forefront of making sure that folks are aware of any sort of reform and changes that are going on. Right now, we have Bill C-11 on the table, which is an act to amend the Broadcasting Act. And there's a lot at stake, I think, in this bill. I've seen, just on Instagram and social media, a certain ad by a prominent Canadian major label signee who has advocated really kind of against CanCon. Can you explain a little bit about what's at stake here with C-11 and what CIMA is specifically advocating for?
Well, if we look at the music ecosystem today, tech platforms dominate the business now. They're not music companies, they're tech companies. And Canadian consumers, Canadian music lovers have been opened up to an incredible world of access to music. And I don't know if people are too aware, I know I certainly wasn't at first, that these companies, which, by the way, are some of the largest, most profitable, and most powerful companies in the history of the world. And they don't pay income tax in Canada for the revenues that they bring in Canada. And I would say likely that's the scenario in most countries of the world. But even beyond that, and perhaps more importantly than that, is that I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe there's no other for-profit or not-for-profit entity in Canada that does not work within a regulatory framework that they have to adhere to in order to be allowed to do business in Canada. And so, while C-11 does a lot of different things and is, by the way, primarily focused on the audiovisual sector, so essentially film and television, that's really where the bulk of the bill is focused on that. But for the purposes of trying to bring our platform partners within the regulatory framework that we all have to work, including radio broadcasters, terrestrial, as well as satellite. That's C-11's purpose ultimately. And we can talk about the profit margin at Spotify, and we are talking about that stuff, and that is important. But more broadly speaking, there's a real question here about the democratic institutions of Canada and our ability to, through our democratically elected governments, set the terms for business in Canada for everyone, and including these platforms. We spoke earlier about foreign-owned multinational record labels. They're here, but they adhere to Canadian regulatory rules and always have, and have actually done quite well within them. So this represents a number of issues that are much broader and bigger and more serious than the Canadian music industry itself.
And are there Canadians working in the music industry that are presenting a different argument?
Well, I mean, there's many different arguments out there. Unfortunately, out of the gate, this issue was marred in all sorts of misinformation and was used as a way of fundraising in the political realm based on that misinformation. And that really muddied the waters. And in those muddy waters enters the tech platforms. And, I think it's obviously, not an original thought right now to say we're in an era of misinformation. And that's kind of what is happening here with C-11. It isn't a perfect thing, but the principle behind it I support, because it is about how we as a society decide what kind of cultural policy objectives we want to pursue. And once we decide what they are, how do we do that? How do we do it? Well, we've decided in the past, we're going to compel private radio stations to play 35% Canadian music. And that hasn't worked perfectly at all. There's no question about that. But it's undeniable that it has worked. There's lots of problems with it, but it has worked. The investments factor is made. Has worked. We literally have a thriving music industry, a domestic music industry in Canada. We have music companies now that are strong and have offices outside of Canada as well and have real success. But we're in a shift. And the idea that Spotify and YouTube and Apple and, all the other ones should contribute some amount directly into what we already know is working. I think that's fair. Of course, I'm not Daniel Ek, and, I understand, this is business and everyone's going to try to get the best deal they can get. That's fine. And I accept that, and I think everyone does, from the Government of Canada to the CRTC all the way down. I accept that. We're going to all fight for as good a deal as possible. That is one thing. But to go out and misrepresent this as a tax, for example, is just, it's misrepresentation. It's disingenuous to go out on a campaign as the association that represents these massive corporations has, without fully disclosing to the Canadian public that the people that are footing the bill for this campaign are Spotify and the other ones, is disingenuous in my view. And so, let's have the debate and the battle inside the regulatory arena, just like we had the battle inside the political arena about C11. And we fought that fight, all of us, for 3 years. The government passed it, they modified it, they changed it, they listened to a lot of people from all sides, and no one got everything they wanted, and consequently, pretty well all of us are unhappy with the bill in some way, shape, or form. So I accept and welcome that sort of policy work with platforms, with our international partners, with the government, with the regulator. But I think, misinformation and disingenuous campaigns are unfortunate and don't help. They don't help our sector.
I wanted to get into a bit about the political climate that we're currently finding ourselves in. And, I say this with the idea that by the time this airs, we could be facing a whole different situation. Who knows at this point? For the Canadian independent music sector, both recorded and live, what is this moment when we're looking at tariffs, when we're looking at really intensely strict immigration policies, as well as the endangerment of our citizens and our music industry workers that they might be facing in the US? What does this mean for the Canadian independent music industry at this moment?
Well, we don't know is the answer. We do not know. Oh, I suppose if I look at this from just a purely business perspective, the US is our biggest market, and we don't know whether that market is going to be as available, or we don't know if it's going to make as much sense as it once did. So we're in a kind of a holding pattern until we understand that.
Is there a silver lining for Canadian independent artists and music industry workers that we can see gaining opportunities within Canada? Do you see a possible scenario where Canadian artists and music companies can benefit from a Buy Canadian mentality?
So first of all, I don't know whether opportunities are limited now. I wouldn't say that they are. It's unclear whether any of those tariffs are going to directly affect the music sector. That's very unclear right now. And it would be hard to kind of understand, other than for physical goods, how it would affect us, right? So we have to be careful here that this may not necessarily affect us directly. However, we need a stable context that if we're investing in a market, you want to know that it's stable, you want to know that it's predictable, you want to know what you're getting into, you want to be clear on the rules, and you want to make sure that it's safe. And those issues are starting to be questioned because we see that internally a lot of rules are changing. We're seeing trade agreements that are being, sort of, at least rhetorically, abrogated. So I think that in those ways, things might affect some parts of our music industry. Having said that, I believe that we could do much more work within Canada, but we're a country of 40 million people spread out across a continent, a thin band, sparsely populated. It's not really set up for the music industry. For a critical mass and for a thriving sector, we need to find other markets, other trade routes. And we are really no different than most other sectors of the Canadian economy. And why would we be? The biggest market is there. The biggest consumer market in the world is there. So it makes sense that we oriented our businesses there. And what we don't know right now is whether that can continue. And if it does continue, does it make sense to continue, or does it continue at a reduced rate? We don't really know any of that yet. So I would say on this date, February 26th, which is when we're talking, people shouldn't change their plans to perform in the US.
I know that there was recently in the news, you guys got some big press from this for some reason. People got all interested because CIMA decided to pull out of Canada House at South by this year. What was some of the motivations behind that decision? And is that kind of keeping in line with what we're talking about here?
Well, as you can imagine, that was a pretty hard decision to make. And there was a number of factors that forced our hand to make the decision when we made it. So, I had just talked about how you need to know that the context that you're investing in is going to have a level of predictability, stability, safety. You want to be as confident as you can be that it's going to be worthwhile, right? So those things are there, and they're there always. And up till now, the assessment has been, yeah, all those things, all those boxes are ticked. I think we can do it. And CIMA is a not-for-profit. Dollars are super tight, and this is our biggest spend of the year. This is the biggest lift of the year. So in there, we also have other unknowns, right? We don't, at this point, or at least before we made the decision, now we pretty well know this is going to happen. We didn't know if tariffs were going to come into effect, and not that they would directly affect us, but they may affect the climate. We don't know what kind of government reaction we're going to get in Ontario, but I suspect, given the existential threat to the auto sector that these tariffs represent, the response from the Ontario government is going to be, as they say, robust, right? We don't know how that's going to affect anything. We don't know how that's going to affect cross-border business. We just don't know. We're going to get a new prime minister of Canada. We don't know what the announcement's going to be with a new prime minister. We know that they're working through all of this right now. So we don't know anything about that. And we don't know what those decisions are going to be. We could confidently put our stamp of approval on this entire process this year. We just didn't feel like we could do it, and we'll divert those funds to other things right now. And hopefully everything that I'm saying I'm wrong about. And then we can go back next year, and that'll be awesome. But I wasn't prepared to take that chance this year based on an unprecedented turn of events that no one, I think, contemplated. So that's why.
Yeah, this wasn't on our bingo cards, as they say.
Well, one other little point is that all the artists that play at South by at Canada House, as a precondition to being able to play at Canada House, they already have to have a official showcase at South by. So all the artists that are going to South by have at least one performance already.
So it's not like they're losing out on the experience in general.
That's right. There's one opportunity that they won't have to perform, but that's one of, hopefully for most artists, that's one of several.
Yeah. We're talking a lot about unknowns. And when you were just talking about the state that the artists that both you and our organization are working with, these are some of our most vulnerable workers in this industry. I'm wondering if we can lift it up a little bit, pick it up a bit. And most of the folks who are listening to the show are artists and independent music workers. Can we give some encouragement? And is there something to look forward to? Is there something that we can do? Is there a call to action for the music workers of Canada that we can get involved and maybe even just feel some agency over the times we're living in?
I think the sort of way in which Canadians are generally reacting to the sort of the baiting that's happening right now is to I look around and realize that we actually have a pretty amazing country here. And I think like music and musicians play a really big part in that. But it's true that some of the most important things about a culture and a society are undervalued monetarily and structurally. And you think about public school teachers and nurses, just as two examples, right? But you could think about artists too, musicians. Musicians, have to spend countless hours learning how to just play some tunes and to be able to get up there and perform, like countless unpaid hours, countless hours of discipline and focus. And we do need music. We know that. It's really an important way that we communicate to each other. And so I guess what I would say is we do need to keep doing those things. And I would encourage people to look at what they do within the context of the broader society and see themselves as a really important member of their communities, and that the work they're doing is vital. It's different, albeit, but it is vital. And that's hard to know sometimes or believe in because of the difficult ways in which people have to navigate their lives in order to be able to do it. So I would encourage people to just do what they're doing and also think about how they make a living to keep a roof over their heads and to have a stable life. Might not be directly from their music. And that doesn't mean that they're not pursuing successful music careers, but it's important to kind of be healthy and stable. And I think that our industry needs to champion that for the people that work in it, first and foremost, the musicians themselves.
Great. Keeping it positive and to keep going in that direction. There's some big celebrations coming up. As we mentioned, it's CIMA's 50th year in this world, and lots of cool things that you guys are up to this year. I think the first time we're going to get to celebrate CIMA's 50th is at the Junos coming up, correct?
That's right. Yeah, we will do an event on the Saturday night, the night before the broadcast. And it really is a celebration of the Canadian-owned music sector. So companies and artists and music industry workers who are really taking on the risks of building Canadian culture and nurturing artists, nurturing businesses. There'll be some really interesting artists performing. And it's mostly just a way for people to come together, and there's not necessarily a specific event in the calendar that really just sort of plants the flag for Canadian-owned independent music. This is an attempt to do that at least once a year.
Yeah, it's in my opinion, best party of the Junos. Such a great celebration, truly, of the independent sector. And there's always just fantastic programming and artists that are performing there. And I also wanted to bring up, too, that you guys are doing Make It Music again. Can you tell folks a little bit about that?
This will be our third annual Make It Music conference, which is going to take place in November this year. And we wanted to find a way to really focus a couple days of learning just specifically on the Canadian-owned sector of the music industry. But the focus of ours is specifically the Canadian-owned sector, and it is also specifically about how we look at the future of this industry, how we prepare for it, what are the factors that we need to understand to build successful music businesses and have success as artists.
It's definitely one of the most future-thinking conferences, and you bring together a lot of thought leaders in the industry. There's a lot of kind of what I would say like thought experimentation and encouragement to kind of future-proof people's music businesses.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. We did really look at the conferences that were out there. And, the first thing is that there's no point in doing what other people are doing. How can we sort of complement some of the work that's being done out there already? And I feel like we've hit a good one, a good spot. And like I said, we're still really early in the stage. This is just going to be our third one. We learned so much after doing the first one, and then we learned so much after the second. And I'm really excited about it. And I don't have much more to say about it other than that.
Certainly, I would encourage folks to check it out and just check out what CIMA is doing year round. There's tons of learning opportunities throughout the year that you guys do, tons of export opportunities. You guys are leading the charge in terms of export programming. And it's always been real top shelf missions that you go on. So
Yeah, if I could just make a little plug for membership in CIMA as well. And it brings with it a bunch of networking opportunities, but it also brings some specific benefits, one of which is a mental health benefit of about 10 half-hour sessions of therapy via Zoom with a therapist, which it also includes coverage for your dependents. There's also help with legal issues and fitness and diet issues. These are all wrapped up in this one benefit that you get with membership. I think it's $150 is the cost of the membership, the 1-year membership. You also get a 1-year free subscription to Chartmetric, which is, I think, really super helpful for artists. And it allows them to kind of get a real sense of where their music is being listened to, how it's being listened to, what sort of ways in which they can, see their career in real time as it is unfolding across a bunch of different digital platforms.
fantastic. And we'll put a link to membership. Highly recommend that folks go and check it out. There's an incredible suite of benefits that come along with your CIMA membership. And on top of it all, you get to be part of an organization that's doing so much good for our industry. So thank you so much for what you do, Andrew. It's been such a pleasure to get to chat with you today.
You too. Thank you.
That's all for this episode, friends. The Refocus podcast is an original production by Folk Canada. Find out more by heading to folkcanada.com/refocus. That's REFOLKUS. The podcast is produced by Kayla Nizon and Rosalyn Dennett and mixed by Jordan Moore at the Pod Cabin. The opening theme is written and performed by King Cardiac, and the artwork is by Jamie Karn. Please give us a download, subscribe, rate, and review to let us know you care, and follow us at folk_Canada on Instagram to submit your questions.